Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, continuing into part two of our discussion on evolution, we're going to talk about the various forms of evidence for evolution that there are. The first and most prevalent probably being fossils. So, as you guys know by this point, fossils are the preserved remnants or impressions left by an organism that lived in the past. They're almost exclusively found in sedimentary rock, igneous and metamorphic. Igneous, obviously, it's melted. Metamorphic, usually too much heat and pressure has been applied in order for it to actually survive that. It can be actual bone, it can be footprints. It can be leaf impressions, it can be anything along those lines. So we know in the fossil formation, our dead animal sinks and the tissue decays. The carcass is then covered with sediment and the lower layers turns into rock. And eventually the rock can be exposed at the surface. The fossil record is the ordered sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers, reveals the appearance of organisms in historical sequence, and it fits with other evidence of evolution. If you go down the Grand Canyon as a classic example of this, if you go down the Grand Canyon, you can see different fossils from different time periods. Now, the downfall of the fossil record is twofold. Number one, it is incomplete because some fossils have been destroyed. Certain tectonic activity, such as earthquakes and volcanoes, or very severe weathering, can actually destroy fossils. The other part that is makes it incomplete is that it really doesn't provide an excellent fossil record of soft tissued organisms. So, for example, sharks that are all cartilage except for their teeth, the only fossil records we have are the teeth themselves. Your worms, the creepy things that crawl in and out that don't necessarily have an exoskeleton, often are lost within the fossil record. You can also have issues because if a species only appeared for, say, a short period of time, geologically speaking, the statistical likelihood of an actual fossil being formed becomes much lower. Okay, this is just an interesting example. This is the evolution of the horse. As you go through, you can see that it has different stages. You can see the toes developing. You can see the teeth development, things like that. Now, biogeography is the geographic distribution of species. Darwin was the first to suggest that organisms evolved from a common ancestor. Um, and it was thought that he really noticed it because he noticed that species on the Galapagos Islands resembled the species that he found on the South American mainland. Uh, they were not exactly the same, but they were similar. Okay. And they actually were more similar than animals on similar but further away islands. Okay. So, like the finches on the Galapagos, more closely related, were they appeared more closely related to the finches on the mainland than, say, the finches in the Canary Islands. Okay, so if you look here, for example, this is just showing we have a common ancestor, and then we have these very tall birds that run quickly, except for the kiwi, which isn't so tall, right? But they have different organisms here, but there probably was a common ancestor at some point in time here, which made for this taller, sort of long-necked bird. Comparative anatomy, this is looking for similarities in anatomy. The big deal here is homologous structures. These are features that have similar structure, but they have different functions. And our classic example of this is the forelimb. If you look at human, cat, whale, and bat, you can see down here, let's see, does this allow, oh, laser pointer, how about that, nifty? Down here, you have the phalanges, okay, which are our fingers. Okay. You have the carpals, those are sort of at the top here. Okay. The metacarpals are, I'm sorry, no, metacarpals are here. Sorry, carpals are here. This is the wrist. Okay. And then you have the humerus, the radius in that sort of orangish color, and then the ulna. I always remember which is which because the radius and the ulna, PU, your ulna is close to your pinky. Okay? Okay, let's see if I can now take this off. Okay, beautiful. Yay! Vestigial structures, small body structures that may have been functional in the ancestors of a species but has no real function at the present time. Humans, our classic vestigial structures are our appendix. I've heard before that there is some belief that the appendix may have been actually really fundamental in helping to digest raw meat. Our tailbone. We do not have a tail. Other examples in many snakes, most snakes, in fact, do have a pelvis. Whales have a pelvis, and in addition, they also have a vestigial femur, which is an indication that they once walked on land. Comparative embryology, there was this whole concept that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is if you look at the embryonic development, you can see evolution as it's going. So, for example, humans, we have gill pouches that appear very early in embryonic development. If you look here at this is a classic. I honestly, the name of the scientist who drew this is eluding me at the moment. But you can see, humans do have a tail at a important time in our lives. It then dies off through apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, very similar to the webbing in between our fingers. Yes, every so often you do have a human that is born with a tail. It can be very easily removed. You see the gill slits across the board. But if you look at very early embryonic development, we're not all that different from one another, and people have often used this as a piece of evidence of evolution. Molecular biology, this has gotten us a lot further, okay, when we look at genes and gene expression. One of the big things here is the universality of the genetic code. A, T, C, and G are the bases of DNA. It does not matter if we are dealing with a prokaryotic, very simple bacteria, a virus, which we don't even know whether to classify as living or non-living, all the way up to what we would call a more advanced organism, at least from a standpoint of organization. One of the big things here is like the conservation of the amino acid sequence and hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is virtually unchanged throughout the entirety of the animal kingdom. Okay, and if we look here, our percent matched to our DNA match to chimpanzee were slightly over 98%. Humans are. Gorillas are a little bit less, more of 97%, and then you keep going down, and you get to your old world monkeys that are considered less closely related. But we share a great deal of our DNA with a chimpanzee. That would be our closest evolutionary relative. And then this just shows the last common ancestor. Now, keep in mind, please, 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 as you're doing this, and as people get into debates as to whether or not evolution exists, which is, it's a theory, it's always a good thing to debate. Please keep in mind that the scientific theory is not that humans evolved from chimpanzees. If that were the case, humans or chimpanzees would no longer exist. The scientific belief is that we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees that have then deviated from that. And that is where I am going to call it with this particular topic, and then we'll get into population evolution next time.